Okay, so have you ever thought about this, like, as a philosopher? I mean, is the future already, like, set in stone? Is everything already determined? Or is there, like, a real openness, a bunch of possibilities that could or could not happen?
Right. Yeah, it's a really fundamental question that's been bugging thinkers for like forever, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
today we're going to like dive deep into this, you know?
Gaily.
We're going to look at how medieval philosophers tackle this whole thing about future contingents.
Medieval theories of future
I know,
contingents.
like,
It's a mouthful.
yeah, it is. But it's super interesting stuff, especially if you're into philosophy.
For sure. And, our listener, you send us some really cool resources on this. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry was like the gold mine.
Oh, yeah. That entry is awesome.
Yeah.
It really like unpacks all these super smart medieval minds and how they wrestled with these ideas about the future, the
Yeah.
things that might or might not happen.
Yeah, those maybe yes, maybe no kind of statements about what's to come.
Exactly. And that's what we call future contingents, right?
Yeah. Right. And for this deep dive, what we really want to get at is like, what did these medieval thinkers believe about whether these statements about future contingent events actually have a definite truth value right now, like in this moment?
Yeah, like can we say for sure if something in the future is going to be true or false right now?
Right. And if so, what does that mean for all these huge philosophical ideas like necessity and possibility?
And don't forget divine foreknowledge.
Oh, yeah. How does God fit into all of this? If God knows everything, does that mean everything's predetermined?
Huge questions, right?
Huge questions. So, to kick things off, we got to go back to the OG, Aristotle.
Right back to the source.
He kind of started this whole debate in his book, De Interpretatione, especially chapter 9.
That's where things get juicy.
Right. So, he basically throws out this challenge. He's like, okay, we all agree that for any two contradictory statements, like it's raining and it's not raining, one has got to be true and the other has got to be false, right?
A classic law of non-contradiction.
Exactly. But then he's like, hold up, does that same principle always apply to statements about the future? Those future contingents we're talking about.
And that's where things get tricky, because it raises this fundamental question about necessity.
Right. Because if I say today, there will be a sea battle tomorrow, and that statement is already definitely true, does that mean the sea battle is like unavoidable?
Yeah, like is it already set in stone? Is it a necessary outcome?
And what's so interesting is that Aristotle himself doesn't really give us a straight answer in that chapter.
It's kind of infamous for being open to interpretation.
Yeah, he lays out the problem so clearly, but he doesn't give us a yes or no.
Which, of course, sparked centuries of debate.
Exactly. And that's where Boethius comes in a few centuries later.
Yeah, Boethius was like the bridge between Aristotle and the medieval world.
Right. The encyclopedia really emphasizes how crucial he was in translating and interpreting Aristotle for all those Latin-speaking medieval philosophers.
And what's really cool is that Boethius was aware of other ancient interpretations of Aristotle, too. So he was bringing in even more perspectives.
Adding another layer to the whole thing.
Totally. And one of the things that Boethius did that's super important for us as philosophers is that he introduced these terms definitely and indefinitely, true or false.
Interesting.
Yeah, he seems to be picking up on some earlier Greek discussions, maybe from commentators like Ammonius, although we don't have direct evidence that he actually read Maimonides' work on this.
Okay, so how do scholars interpret Boethius's position on all of this?
Well, there are two main ways of reading him. One is that he thought Aristotle was actually putting limits on the principle of bivalence. That fundamental idea that every statement has to be either true or false.
So he's saying that bivalence doesn't apply to future contingents.
Right. So a statement like there will be a sea battle tomorrow isn't actually true or false yet. It's kind of in this logical limbo.
Like it's not determined yet.
Exactly. The other interpretation is that Boethius wasn't denying that future contingents have a truth value, but he was saying that their truth isn't settled yet. It's not determined in the same way as statements about the present or the past.
Because the things that would make the statement true or false haven't happened yet.
Right. It's like saying a seed has the potential to become a flower, but we don't know what color the flower will be until it actually blooms.
That's a really good analogy. It's like having all the ingredients for a recipe, but the dish isn't cooked yet, so we can't really say what it tastes like.
Exactly. And Boethius also really stressed this idea of the necessity of the present.
Okay, what did he mean by that?
He was saying that events happening right now are necessary in the sense that they're actually happening. They are what they are, but they could have been contingent. They didn't have to happen in the first place.
So what's happening now is necessary because it's actually happening, but it wasn't necessarily going to happen?
Exactly. And this is super important for understanding how he brings God into the picture. Boethius believed that God knows future contingents as contingent, not as necessary.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting for anyone into philosophy of religion, right? How can God know for sure what's going to happen in the future if those events aren't already fixed?
Right, that's the big question. And Boethius tackled it head on in his book, The Consolation of Philosophy, where he introduces this really profound idea of God's atemporal knowledge.
A temporal meaning outside of time.
Exactly. Boethius's argument is that God doesn't foreknow things in a temporal sense, because for God, all of time is present all at once in this eternal now.
So God doesn't see the future as something that will happen later. It's all happening simultaneously for God.
Exactly. So from God's perspective, statements about what we see as the future are definitely true or false based on what God eternally perceives. But that doesn't mean those future events are simply necessary from our limited temporal perspective.
So there's a distinction between God's knowledge making something true and that thing being inherently necessary.
Precisely, and Boethius made this really important distinction between necessitas consequentiae, which is the conditional necessity that if God knows something is true, then it must be true, and necessitas consequentis, which is the simple necessity of the event itself.
Okay, so to put it another way for our listeners, it's necessary that if God knows there will be a sea battle, then there will be a sea battle. But that doesn't mean the sea battle itself was a necessary event. It could have gone the other way.
You got it. That's a really subtle but super important distinction, and it became like a cornerstone for all the medieval thinkers who came after Boethius as they tried to figure out how to reconcile divine omniscience with human freedom and the contingency of the world.
So Boethius sets the stage, and then what happens? The encyclopedia talks about all these developments from Abelard to Aquinas. So let's dive into that period.
Yeah, after Boethius, we see this like explosion of philosophical thinking about these questions.
It's like Boethius opened up a whole new can of worms.
He totally did. So we have Anselm of Canterbury, for example.
Yeah.
He takes Boethius's distinction and refines it further with his own distinction between antecedent and consequent necessity.
Okay, break that down for us.
He applied this especially to discussions of God's knowledge and prophecy, like when God reveals something about the future.
And what was his main point?
His key argument was that just because a prophecy based on divine revelation ends up being true, that doesn't mean that the event it predicted was destined to happen. It does become necessary retroactively.
So the prophecy being true doesn't force the event to happen.
Exactly, and he used the example of Mary's faith in the prophecy of Christ's death.
Okay.
Her unwavering belief wasn't the cause of Christ's free decision to die.
It didn't make it happen.
Right, her faith was true precisely because that was the future freely chosen action.
Ah, I see. So it's the future contingent event that makes the statement true, not some kind of preordained necessity.
Exactly, and then we come to Peter Abelard, who's like this towering figure in medieval philosophy.
What did Abelard contribute to the debate?
Well, he really dug into the whole issue of how contingency and divine omniscience can coexist, and he even engaged with arguments from Cicero way back in ancient Rome.
That's going way back.
Yeah, Abelard was a serious scholar, and he famously used this logical tool called the dissensu and the redistinction to analyze modal statements, statements about possibility and necessity.
Okay, I think our listeners who are really into logic and philosophy of language would love to hear more about that distinction. Can you explain it?
Sure. So imagine this statement. It is possible that a thing is otherwise than God knows it to be.
Right.
Now, if we interpret that dissensu, we're looking at the possibility of the whole statement being true. Old prompt proposition, a thing is otherwise than God knows it to be. And Abelard said that interpretation leads to a false statement because God's knowledge is infallible. God can't be wrong.
Right.
But if we interpret it differently, we focus on a specific thing in the world and ask if that thing could be different from how God knows it to be.
So we're zeroing in on the thing itself, not the whole statement about God's knowledge.
Exactly. And in that case, the first part, the contingent nature of the thing is true. Lots of things could have been different. But the second part, that God would be wrong about it, doesn't follow logically. If things were different, God would just know them as they actually are.
So it's like Abelard is performing surgery on Cicero's argument, showing that it's based on mixing up these two different ways of understanding possibility in relation to God's knowledge.
That's a great way to put it. He's untangling the logic.
So where did Abelard land on the whole truth value of future contingents thing?
He believed that future contingent statements are either true or false. So he upholds bivalence. but he said they're not determinately true or false before the event happens.
Okay, so there's a difference between something being true or false and it being determinately true or false.
Right, and he made this really key distinction between determinateness and certainty. So, for example, a future event might be certain if God has revealed it, but it's not determinately true in the sense that it's already a fixed fact.
So there's a difference between knowing something for sure and it being like locked in.
Precisely. And then the encyclopedia introduces us to the nominalists, these 12th century thinkers who had this interesting thesis: what is once true is always true.
That sounds like a very static view of reality for someone concerned with truth and time.
Yeah, it might seem that way at first, but their argument was actually more nuanced. They were focused on the content of statements, what they meant.
Okay.
So they said that the underlying meaning of a statement about a specific time stays the same no matter what tense you use or when you say it.
So like, there will be a sea battle tomorrow and there was a sea battle yesterday ultimately mean the same thing.
Exactly. They express the same basic proposition. And that proposition, they argued, has a fixed truth value eternally, even if it's about an event that was contingent.
So the truth is fixed, but the event itself wasn't necessary.
Right, and Peter of Poitiers, a major figure among the nominals, argued that these statements about specific contingent things are immutably true or false
Yeah.
because of God's eternal choice.
But God's choice locks in the truth.
But crucially, he said, their truth value could have been the opposite if God had chosen differently.
So there's still a sense of contingency there.
Absolutely. And this period also saw a really important shift in how philosophers thought about modality in general.
Modality meaning possibility and necessity.
Right. They started moving towards a model of simultaneous or synchronic alternatives.
What does that mean?
It's a shift away from the traditional focus on the necessity of the present. That idea that what's happening now is the only possibility.
So instead of just thinking about what's actually happening, they started considering other possibilities that could be happening at the same time.
Exactly. And this is a pretty big change. Can you give us some examples of how this new way of thinking played out?
Sure. So we already talked about Abelard. He argued that at any given moment, while the actual event is happening, there are also these unrealized alternatives that were genuinely possible at the same time.
Like other paths that reality could have taken.
Right, and Gilbert of Poitiers took it even further. He suggested that even the laws of nature, what we usually think of as necessities, are actually contingent on God's free choice.
Whoa, so he's saying that God could change the laws of nature.
That's what he's suggesting,
Okay.
yeah. And he even imagined Plato's Platonides as encompassing not only Plato's actual life, but also all the ways Plato could have been, but never was.
Like a whole multiverse of Platos.
Exactly. And Robert Grosseteste theorized about modalities originating from eternity based on God's eternal plan and contrasted these with eternal contingencies that still depended on God's free will.
So it's like a whole landscape of possibilities that God chooses from.
And all of these ideas come together in the work of Thomas Aquinas, right?
Aquinas was like the grand synthesizer. He took all these threads from Aristotle, Boethius, Abelard, and wove them into his own grand philosophical tapestry.
And the encyclopedia really dives deep into Aquinas' views.
It does. Aquinas argued that God has this atemporal grasp of all reality, all of time, in a single eternal vision.
So for Aquinas, God didn't have to foresee our actions. He simply sees them all at once.
Exactly. And while events have a certain necessity by supposition, meaning in relation to God's perfect knowledge and plan, many of those same events are still contingent in terms of their immediate causes and the free will of the people involved.
So God's knowledge doesn't take away our freedom.
Right. Aquinas, following Boethius, thought that if all statements about specific times had a definite truth value right now, it would lead to determinism, which would undermine contingency.
So to avoid that, he said that future contingent propositions are true or false in a disjunctive sense, meaning either this will happen or it won't, but their definite truth value is something only God knows for sure.
Exactly. But it's interesting because Aquinas' whole doctrine of divine providence does lean towards a kind of providential determinism, even though he affirms secondary causes and our limited human knowledge.
So it's a delicate balance between God's absolute knowledge and the contingency of the world.
For sure. And not everyone was on board with Aquinas' synthesis.
Right. The encyclopedia mentions that other thinkers like Scotus had some issues with his ideas.
Yeah, they raised important questions, particularly about the logic of simultaneity within God's eternal vision, and how God's absolute simplicity and immutability could work with the contingency of his choices and the free actions of creatures.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and go back to how medieval thinkers interpreted Aristotle himself, because the encyclopedia points out two main schools of thought.
Yeah, so on one hand, you have Abelard, who we talked about earlier. He said that Aristotle did believe in bivalence, meaning future contingents are either true or false even now, but he denied their determinate truth or falsity before the event actually occurs.
So Abelard is saying the statement itself is true or false, but the event isn't settled yet?
Exactly. And then you have the opposing view, the traditional interpretation, which became really popular among 13th century commentators like Albert the Great Aquinas and even influential Arabic thinkers like Al-Farabi and Averroes.
So what did this traditional view say?
They argue that Aristotle rejected the determinate truth or falsity of future contingents, specifically to avoid fatalism.
They thought he was worried about everything being predetermined.
Right. They understood Aristotle's careful wording in Chapter 9 as a rejection of the idea that statements about the future have a fixed truth value now. They said future contingents are only true or false in a disjunctive sense, meaning either it will happen or it won't, but we can't say for sure which one until it happens.
So they thought Aristotle was intentionally vague to keep the future open.
Exactly. But as the encyclopedia points out, this traditional interpretation creates some tension with the theological idea of unrestricted bivalence for divine omniscience and prophecy.
Because if God knows all truth, including the future, then logically those future events must already have a definite truth value in the present.
Right. So there's this inherent tension, and that's where the later medieval period comes in, with thinkers like John Duns Scotus and William Ockham offering their own solutions.
They stepped up to the plate to try and resolve this tension.
And they did it in really interesting ways. Scotus, for example, developed this intricate metaphysical framework centered on the concept of being and this vast realm of logical possibilities.
So he's thinking big picture.
Totally. And he fully embraced the idea of simultaneous alternatives and rejected the idea that the present moment is the only necessary one. He argued that God knows all possible scenarios and the determinate truth values of future contingent propositions, but that doesn't make those future events necessary.
So God's knowledge doesn't force things to happen.
Exactly. And this was crucial for him to maintain human free will alongside divine omniscience. And to explain how God's choices could be contingent, even though they're eternal, he introduced this idea of instance of nature within the divine intellect.
Okay, so Scotus is saying the future is open, there are many possibilities, and God knows which one will happen, but that knowledge doesn't determine the outcome. People still have free will.
Precisely. And William Ockham agreed with Scotus about God's contingent choice and the inherent truth or falsity of future contingents. But he wasn't so keen on Scotus's instance.
What did Occam propose instead?
Well, he's famous for arguing that even though God's foreknowledge exists in what we see as the past, its content is about the future, so it doesn't fall under the principle of the necessity of the past.
Meaning, just because God knows something in the past doesn't mean it had to happen that way.
Exactly. And this is the core of the Ockhamist view on divine foreknowledge, which is still debated and discussed in philosophy today.
So Occam is saying that God's knowledge is located in the past, but it's directed towards the future, so it doesn't have to be necessary.
It's a really clever way to deal with this seemingly impossible problem.
But not everyone in the later Middle Ages was happy with these solutions, right?
Right. The encyclopedia talks about Walter Chatton, who was a big critic of Occam and others. And then there's Peter Oriel, who had this really radical view.
What did Ariel say?
He said that future contingent propositions don't have a definite truth value at all, not even for God. He described God's knowledge as indistant, meaning it's beyond our categories of time.
So he's saying God's knowledge is so different from ours that we can't even apply our logic to it.
Exactly. But this view was pretty controversial, and it was eventually condemned by the church.
Yeah, it shows you just how far these medieval thinkers were willing to go to try and figure out this whole divine foreknowledge thing.
They were pushing the boundaries, and in 14th century England, there were even more discussions about determinate and indeterminate truth and falsity, with some thinkers suggesting that we might need to tweak the whole idea of bivalence to deal with statements about the future.
So maybe classical logic doesn't fully capture the complexity of time in the future.
Maybe not. And then later on in the early modern period, Luis de Molina came up with his influential theory of middle knowledge, scientia media.
What's that all about?
It's another attempt to explain how God can know about free human actions. It's like God has this counterfactual knowledge of what any possible creature would freely choose in any given situation.
Though God knows all the what-ifs.
Exactly. So to sum up this whole whirlwind tour, we started with Aristotle's logical puzzle about the truth of future contingent statements and the danger of fatalism. Then we have Boethius, who brought Aristotle's ideas to the Latin West, and introduced those crucial distinctions.
And then from Abelard to Aquinas, we saw all these amazing attempts to reconcile divine omniscience with human freedom and the contingency of the future, leading to different views on bivalence, necessity, possibility, and even the nature of time itself.
And then in the later Middle Ages, we have Scotus and Occam developing these complex metaphysical frameworks, while others like Oriol explored more unconventional ideas.
It's amazing to see how these medieval thinkers wrestled with such profound questions.
And what's really cool is that these debates are still relevant today. The questions about truth, time modality, free will, and divine knowledge are still at the forefront of contemporary philosophy.
So, understanding how these medieval thinkers approach these issues can really help us in our own philosophical journeys.
Absolutely. So here's a thought for you, our listener. Given all these intricate medieval debates, how might a contemporary philosopher tackle the question of the truth value of future contingent statements, especially considering all the advances in logic in our understanding of time?
Or maybe a different angle is this long historical struggle to reconcile divine foreknowledge with human free will, offer any insights for our own attempts to understand agency and the open future.
We've only just scratched the surface of this massive and fascinating topic, so we encourage you to keep digging into the specific arguments of these thinkers and the concepts they developed. Maybe revisit that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry or explore some of the primary and secondary sources listed there. There's a whole world of thought out there waiting to be explored.
And that's our deep dive for today.
So until next time.